Reiner Schürmann's confrontation with Immanuel Kant is just as provocative as his better-known Heidegger reading. Schürmann places Kant within his phenomenology of epochs to represent a stage in modernity when subjectivity reigns over the presencing of being. That principle for Schürmann assumes, even if tacitly, the event of being, unfolding through the epochs. In looking for that ontology implicit in Kant, a significant point for Schürmann is the notion of givenness, preceding categorical determination. Despite the autonomy asserted of the subject as legislator of laws in cognition and ethics, the subject cannot but presuppose and passively receive that givenness of being as extrinsic to its scope of determination. For Schürmann, the presencing slash absencing of being in its givenness can only be expressed in the middle voice, an event, that I would characterize as an auto-determination of the indeterminate, and further as an ontological, that's an slash ontological. In that being preceding its determination is a nothing. So section 1, being is not a predicate. Kant first developed his notion of being preceding his Copernican turn in the sole possible foundations for a proof demonstrating the existence of God, where he argues that being as the position, Setzung, of a thing in relation to the ideal system of rules for thought cannot be conceived as a predicate and adds nothing to the conceived content. Schürmann takes this to be an ideal but prethetic understanding of being, preceding the subject's conceptual activity. Being is thus found in the givenness of what is given prior to conception or even intuition. He formulates this as Setzung, positing, equals gegeben sein, being given, equals Dasein, existence. Finding this general understanding of being, qua givenness, to remain in the critical Kant, despite ambiguities and terminological shifts. Kant continues to assume in the Critique of Pure Reason that pre-categorial apprehension of being, but the terminology shifts as Setzung and its cognates now designate being as a category in the mind's activity. Yet, without givenness from which to begin, signified now by Position, cognition, thought, even consciousness would be impossible. Moreover, with the critical turn, givenness is no longer the furnishing of a system of ideal rules for thinking, but relative to experience. As the meaning of being other than the categorial, Position now signifies the moment of givenness, falling beyond the scope of the categories, except by endowing it with negative determinations, precognitive, precategorial, predicative. Kant thus restates his non-dogmatic formula of being, quote, being, or sein, is obviously not a real predicate, i.e. a concept of something that could add to the concept of a thing. It is merely the position of a thing, unquote. Schürmann explains that real here no more designates the first category of quality than being here designates the second category of modality, i.e. Dasein. Being as such is not among the a priori predicates. While being as Dasein or existence is thinkable a priori, being as sein is not thinkable a priori at all. It precedes transcendental activity. The distinction between Position and Setzung shifts several times throughout Kant's works. Schürmann insists that no definite terminological distinction is established until the Critique of Judgment, wherein, in distinction from the first critique, Position now names categorical being, existence as a category of modality, while Setzung, like in the pre-critical Beweisgrund, ontological proof, names pre-categorical givenness. In Setzung here, Schürmann hears the sound of an originary pathos or suffering on which all transcendental positing depends. Quote, the relation to sensibility of the material one suffers, and hence the actual, the singular, recognized in its contingency and randomness, unquote. Being posited, Gesetztsein, Kant By being posited, Gesetzsein, Kant means the affection of sensibility. In addition to Kant's doctrinal thought that being is a category, a conceptual act, there is thus being as given and encountered in sensibility, preceding all acts of the mind. In the act of categorizing, the subject aspires to universal determination, and yet its determinations are shot through with the indeterminacy it suffers. Rooting the faculties, there is this difference, quote, between being as category and as precognitive, precategorial, prepredicative givenness, unquote. The determining act and the suffering that undetermines that act in advance. What Schürmann calls the transcendental different, a term he borrows from Lyotard. Section 2, the duplicity of being. In Kant's transcendental project, there is a dualism of spontaneity and receptivity arising from that fundamental difference between acts of consciousness and the givenness of precategorial existence, voicing what Schürmann calls a double comprehension of being. He notes two Kantian replies to the question of being as Position, articulating synthesis, and being as Setzung, articulating dispersion. The former is the possibility of things contoured by the mind's act, and the latter is the actuality of things given irrespective of the mind, encountered contingently, being understood doctrinally as active positioning, Position, through a modal category, and being understood in a countervailing manner as precategorial givenness, Setzung. The doctrinal answer pushes towards unification, but the countervailing answer pulls towards plurification. Schürmann takes these senses to be in tension, bearing an ontological rift that shatters the assumed autonomy of transcendental subjectivity. In this tear, Kant's doctrine of being as a category is subverted by the need for being as precategorially given, displacing full self-presence that would guarantee order out of the subject's reach. Being thus undergoes a pathetic divide and hybridization between the universal that is the thesis and the singular that is the given. Thesis results from subjective spontaneity in the modal act of positing some possible existing or necessary thing. Givenness designates actuality outside of the concept, quote, something real that is given, not as appearance, nor as thing in itself, noumenon, but as something which actually exists, unquote. Prior to transcendental determination, Schürmann argues, we thus discover the liminal occurrence of pathos, revealing an asymmetrical duality distinguishing Setzung from Position. It, quote, refers the subject to what is other, heterogeneity, unquote. Categorial being is therefore pathetically bound to that other being. For Schürmann, this marks the margin of categorial ontology, bordering the regime of spontaneity. Beyond is an ungraspable surplus of singularity, heterogeneous material. So the next section, section 3, the subject as determiner. Being as category for Kant is one fundamental mode of synthesizing data into a unity, which when gathered together with the pure forms of intuition has objective validity. To know is to impose forms on phenomena, and to judge is to apply a law to some fact or occurrence. Ways of gaining security in the stable order of schemata and categories, establishing, quote, the familiar, something that no longer disturbs, unquote. The Kantian self is the determining self, the determiner of the manifold, bestower of law, legislator of objectivity, effectuating judgments, rendering beings observable and knowable. In the ethical sphere as well, its will is autonomous in making universal law, even as it must submit to it as both subject and object of that volitional act. The law of laws reigning over the modern epoch as arche in Schürmann's phenomenology is this formal I, subjectivity, organizing experience. The subject, however, fails to fulfill its normative expectations for being permeated by what it requires, the dispersive pull of the given. The question of being in Kant thus leads to the question of the self as self-legislating subject. And this sharpens the enigma of the countervailing non-doctrinal comprehension of being with regard to the source of that spontaneity behind, quote, the I think that expresses the act of determining my existence, unquote. Kant says, quote, I am conscious of myself not as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am, unquote. And following it, he says, quote, existence is already given thereby, but the mode in which I am is not thereby given, unquote. In thought, I am conscious of the fact that I am given prior to determination. Quote, existence here is not yet a category, unquote. The existing I instead is indeterminately given. Section 4, the undetermined givenness of own and other, determined and determining. The one feature from which Kant admitted he could not abstract was givenness. Quote, the feature, namely, that the manifold to be intuited must already be given prior to the synthesis of the understanding and independently of it. How this takes place remains here undetermined, unquote. The footing of the subjectivist regime for Schürmann gestures towards being as originary givenness, remaining indeterminate. The subject's dependence upon givenness signifies its dependence upon contingency, the primacy of exteriority to access the world. Givenness, having to do with affection, implies suffering, passivity, pathos, necessarily delimiting the acting, whereby spontaneous doing is in discord with the affection of the material. In affection, awareness of being, given singularly, is shown to be irreducible to, out of sync with, being universally conceived. Givenness as such is always singular. The singular in Schürmann's reading comes explicitly to the fore in the third critique as the very issue for judging. Referring to Kant's identification of judgment, accounting for singulars with an expanded way of thinking, he thus suggests its possibility beyond the fantasied common. For despite the push towards determination under universal law, there is always the undermining pull of the undetermined givenness of the singular, exhausting our doing and subverting the regime of spontaneous consciousness. Givenness as such delivers its own certainty of an actual reality without the schema of actuality, that something is there. But its origin is not in us. Our concept of being is thus enfeebled. The hegemonic phantasm of subjective autonomy reigns only by denying this tragic condition of pathein, in tragic denial. The Kantian thesis shuts, quote, its eyes to the suffered other upon which it feeds, unquote. Kant nevertheless gives voice to the, quote, unsubsumable other against which spontaneity collides, unquote. His categorical doctrine of being is thus subverted by this pathos or need for pre-categorical givenness. Quote, being as indeterminate givenness precedes being as thesis. It precedes the category provided with a schema, unquote. The differential other thus intervenes to interrupt the I think's full possession, not only of world, but of self. Since indeterminate presence is a distinct moment preceding determination, the subject cannot achieve full self-possession. Ownness is already permeated with otherness, determination with indetermination, appropriation with expropriation. In light of that allo-givenness, or originary heteronomy, Schürmann points to the fictive nature of autonomous self-presence. The subject's hegemony exposed to a suffering it neither makes nor can escape, is not secure. Yet where spontaneous doing collides with its other, there is the awareness that I am. In suffering that pre-categorial assault, we cannot distinguish between me and what happens to me, an indistinct awareness of my existence. Schürmann argues that if the nature of spontaneity that originates every law is that it determines my existence, the I think owes its spontaneity ontologically to the preceding passivity of the I am, designating a not yet determined and still indistinct and unarticulated presence of sensation. Preceding the determining I think, the self is indeterminately given. The existing I is given in an indeterminate way and, quote, impossible to reify into a thing thought, unquote. For, also a quotation, I am conscious of myself, nor as I appear to myself, nor as I am in myself, but only that I am, unquote. In a note appended here, Kant writes, quote, the I think expresses the act of determining my existence. The existence is thereby already given, unquote. Existence as pure sensation precedes all experience. Or rather, I experience my existence, but without observation, as an occurrence of singular givens. The I am singularizes the I think, who is the universal legislator, an originary transgression, but without which the legislating I think would not be. On that basis, the I think acts upon the I am with practical and theoretical rules. We have to, quote, presuppose ourselves entirely a priori as legislating with regard to our own being and also as determining this existence ourselves, unquote. But the presence of this existence, whether auto or allo presence, is not yet determined. Schürmann characterizes this as tragic because the law of what is proper to me is here subverted by the it that happens to me, an alienating counter-law of which I am not master. In presupposing the pathos of irreducible givenness, transcendental legislation is bound to originary suffering. Quote, a counter-law of indistinction to the originary law of I think, unquote, reveals the pathology behind transcendental legislation, the pathos of autonomy, whereby the I think emerges from the indeterminate presence of the I am, without which there would be neither legislation nor law, but with which the law loses respectability. Schürmann argues that this counter-law co-constitutes, yet destitutes beforehand every law, rule, norm, is absolute. Transcendental autonomy is fractured at its core. The will is both above and under the law. It gives itself, transgressing what it legislates. Schürmann thus points to an originary discordance, fracturing the unity of cogitans sum. Self-presence is shattered, broken between thetic normativity and pathos. The two moments of being, determination and indeterminate givenness, equally incontrovertible, co-constitute being, but their break occurs from an originary root. Quote, without the determinate I think arising from indeterminate presence and in turn determining it, there would be no legislation, no law, unquote. The consequence is that the indeterminate presence of being is a necessary condition for any determination or law. Behind every arche is ontological anarche. That root contaminates the ultimate referent of modernity, dispossessing from within self and world possession, placing us at, quote, the mercy of that upon which no active making or doing ever will take hold, unquote. The tragic wound of passivity in the face of ultimate contingency and finitude, death. Givenness intrudes upon transcendental self-consciousness, both from within and both from without and from within. So section 5 is being as doubly bound. A major theme in his posthumous Broken Hegemonies is the double bind. between natality and mortality, with implications for Schürmann's Kant reading. On the one hand, our encounter with the other informs us of our finitude, ultimately pointing to our being for death. Subsumption, on the other hand, judgments, syntheses, imperatives, proceeds from natality, the inclination carrying us along to order chaos. But time inevitably pulls us towards death, which no generic noun can subsume. Mortality exposes me to the assault of the singular, given outside of universal law. We are held in this double bind between the two tendencies of unification and dispersal, order and givenness, birth and death, originating Kantian bifurcation. I would add, however, because this is something that Schürmann doesn't really fully elaborate, so I would add that this bifurcation is rooted in the givenness of both. Birth is also contingent, given despite our control. So the next section, section 6, being in the middle voice as the unknown root. Givenness remains indeterminate because it is determinable as neither subject nor object. One can only speak of it in the middle voice, distancing its effects from the allegedly autonomous spontaneity of the I think, but also from any reified object. The event in the middle voice expresses together the two equally indispensable moments of our being, indeterminacy and self-determination. I would characterize that indeterminate presence or presencing in being determined by and as the I think in terms of an auto-determination of the indeterminate. Furthermore, if being as event, as verbal rather than nominal, is not a being, not an entity, but no thing, we can also characterize it as an/ontological in/determination. Schürmann asks whether Kant's unknown root of the faculties is this raw self-presence. But he adds that this root is fragile and inconceivably deep, yet terribly close in our everydayness. The root is fascicle, twisted, split, following the ultimates of natality and mortality. Mortal embodied existence, caught in the double bind, is the site of its unfolding in and/ontological in/determination. This origin, Kant hints at, no matter how disparate the stems, is expressed in the ambiguous voice of the middle, neither subjective nor objective. Quote, this is Schürmann, in our languages, verbs in the middle voice always lead their speaker out of simple nominative lawmaking. It is then possible to think for itself the double bind that we know, unquote. Despite the subject's alleged autonomy, being happens to one in pathos. In broken hegemonies, subjective autonomy belongs to the modern epoch and is in tension with heteronomy, indicative of the extra-subjective and extra-epochal event of presencing-absencing. This happening undermines our faith in autonomy, even if it can neither be identified fully with the reified heteronomos. The event of being as undetermined determining, escaping law, even in its lawmaking, Schürmann says, is anarchic, in temporal difference from the modern epoch, wherein subjectivity rules as archaic. Escaping the reign of modernity, ontological anarchy roots both givenness and spontaneity, analogous to how the place of nothing for Kyoto school founder Nishida Kitaro envelops the bifurcated stems of Kantian epistemology. For in Schürmann as well, the no, greater than the yes, envelops the double bind of birth and death in their contingencies. As the nothing envelops beings, indeterminacy envelops determination, and anarchic presencing-absencing envelops archic modes of presence. If Schürmann sees ontological anarchy as the extra-epochal root of Kantian subjectivity, we can further characterize this in terms of and/ontological in/determination. Due to its origin, determination therefore remains shot through, permeated with indeterminacy. Its process institutes and destitutes each epoch. But this also opens the potential towards other new beginnings. We can only heed that presencing / absencing and responding and corresponding to the way phenomena appear. Poien kata fusen, that's Heraclitus, to make according to presencing, and start from there. So my conclusion is, on the one hand, Schürmann argues that being in Kant is doubly bound between synthesis and dispersal, universalization and singularization, determining and givenness. Yet he also claims that pathos ultimately reigns, for even spontaneity is given and hence permeated from the start with alterity. In terms of his phenomenology of ultimates, natality is to be thrown into this world, contingent, i.e. born despite our will. Being as such is best expressed in the middle voice, since it occurs despite myself. But it is also not a predicate of some object. We have further characterized this in terms of the autodetermination of the indeterminate. In terms of Schürmann's phenomenology of epochs, it is anarchic, exceeding the laws of the epochal arche, ontological anarchy. That anarchy, we add, is an-ontological, an/ontological, since it is nothing preceding the determination of things, objects, entities, and what I call an/ontological, in/determination. That's it. Thank you.